The dust in Blackwood Creek didn't just settle, it seemed to weigh things down, pressing the spirit out of the men and women who called the valley home. It was 1884, and the law in these parts didn't wear a tin star. It wore the polished brass buttons of the Gilded Rail Company. The Gilded Rail wasn't just a business, it was a slow-moving flood. It moved across the territory, swallowing water rights and grazing land, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and broken spirits. At the head of their local enforcement was Silas Vane, a man with a smile like a razor and a soul like a dry well. On a Tuesday that felt like every other Tuesday, Vane and 4 of his regulators rode into the widow Miller's yard. They didn't come with a warrant or a court order. They came with a ledger. Silas claimed the well on her property was company property, and to pay for the stolen water, they intended to take her 2 plow horses, the only things keeping her family from starvation. When her 15-year-old son, Toby, stepped onto the porch with a rusted, unloaded shotgun, he wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for respect. He didn't get it. Vane dismounted with a practiced, predatory grace, wrenched the gun from the boy's hands, and used the stock to break Toby's jaw. As the widow Miller knelt in the dirt, cradling her son's head, Vane unhitched the horses. "The company thanks you for your contribution," Vane said, his voice a low, mocking drawl. Watching from the shadows of the general store across the road was an old clerk named Eris. He had lived in the valley long enough to remember when the dirt was free and the men were taller. As Silas Vane rode past, Eris didn't look away. He whispered just loud enough for the wind to carry it, "You shouldn't have touched that acreage, Silas. That's Thorne's land." Vane pulled his reins, the leather creaking in the silence. He laughed, spitting a dark stream of tobacco into the dry earth. "Elias Thorne is 6 feet under a mudslide in the high Sierras. I saw the mountain fall myself 7 years ago. There's nothing left of him but a memory and a stain on the rocks." "Mountains move," Eris replied softly, his eyes fixed on the distant, purple peaks of the ridge. "And the earth has a way of spitting out things it can't digest. Men like Thorne, they don't die. They just wait." Vane sneered and kicked his horse into a gallop, the widow's horses trailing behind him in a cloud of bitter dust. But for the first time in years, the people of Blackwood Creek didn't look at the ground. They looked at the horizon. The victory at the Miller farm felt like a final seal on Silas Vane's authority. That evening, the Gilded Rail's headquarters, a converted boarding house at the edge of town, buzzed with the coarse laughter of men who believed they had outrun the reach of God and the law. They drank company whiskey and counted the kickbacks from the latest land seizures. But the night had a different plan. It began 3 miles north of the settlement, at the mouth of the Switchback Canyon. A company supply wagon, laden with payroll and heavy crates of Winchester rifles intended for a new private militia, was making its way through the Narrows. The driver, a seasoned mercenary named Holloway, was no stranger to the dark, but he felt a prickle on the back of his neck that no amount of whiskey could numb. The horses stopped first. They didn't bolt, they simply anchored their hooves and shivered, their ears pinned back against a sound only they could hear. "Hiya!" Holloway barked, snapping the reins. The animals refused to budge. Then, from the rim of the canyon, a pebble tumbled down the rock face. Holloway looked up. Silhouetted against the pale, bloated moon was a rider. The horse was a massive, charcoal-colored beast that seemed to absorb the light around it. The man atop it wore a long, heavy duster, not the clean canvas of a city man, but a garment stained with the gray silt of a riverbed, looking as though it had been pulled from a shallow grave. Holloway reached for his coach gun, but before his fingers could find the trigger, a voice drifted down, not a shout, but a low, resonant rumble that filled the canyon like the coming of a flood. "Leave the team." Walk back toward the lights of the town. Do not look behind you. Holloway was a man of violence, but he was also a man of instinct. There was an ancient, tectonic weight in that voice, a sound that belonged to the man Eris had spoken of. The man who had been buried by a mountain and had apparently spent 7 years digging his way out. Without a word, Holloway climbed down from the bench. He left the payroll. He left the rifles. He began the long walk back to Blackwood Creek, his boots crunching rhythmically in the gravel. By the time Silas Vane and his men reached the canyon the next morning, they found the wagon upright and untouched, but the horses were gone. The payroll was gone. And carved into the wooden side of the wagon, in deep, jagged strokes, was a single word. Restoration. Vane felt a cold draft move through the heat of the canyon. He looked at his men. For the first time, he didn't see the iron-jawed enforcers of the Gilded Rail. He saw men who were suddenly remembering every ghost story they had ever heard. Search the ridge, Vane commanded, though his own voice lacked its usual bite. Find him. If he's a ghost, I'll put him back in the ground. If he's a man, I'll make him wish he had stayed under the mountain. But as the sun climbed higher, the shadows on the ridge didn't disappear. They only grew longer. The disappearance of the payroll was a pebble dropped into a still pond, but the ripples were beginning to disturb more than just Silas Vane's pride. In the center of town stood the Territorial Land Office, a building that had once belonged to the people but now served as the brain of the Gilded Rail's operation. Inside, behind walls of reinforced oak and iron bars, sat the ledger. This wasn't a simple book of accounts, it was a blueprint for a systematic theft. The company wasn't just taking land, they were manipulating the very geography of justice. By rerouting the creek and forging state-level surveys, they were turning fertile homesteads into unusable wasteland on paper, only to seize them for pennies and sell them to the railroad for a fortune. The true antagonist wasn't Silas Vane's gun, it was the ink in that ledger. It was a system designed to ensure that even if a man fought back, he would be fighting a ghost made of paper and bureaucracy. Elias Thorne understood this better than anyone. He knew that killing a man like Vane was easy, but killing a system required a different kind of violence. That night, a series of fires broke out, but not where the regulators expected. They guarded the armory and the stables, expecting a raid. Instead, they watched in horror as the company's 3 outlying telegraph stations, the only lines of communication to the capital, went up in flames simultaneously. Thorne wasn't just coming for them, he was cutting the nerves of the beast. As the fires raged, a figure moved through the town's shadows with the silence of a mountain lion. Thorne didn't go for the whiskey or the gold. He bypassed the guards with a ghost's intuition, appearing inside the land office. The clerk on duty, a young man who had sold his conscience for a steady paycheck, found himself staring into eyes that looked like cold hearthstones. Thorne didn't draw a pistol. He simply placed a hand on the heavy, leather-bound ledger. "This book," Thorne said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to make the floorboards hum. "It contains the names of families who have bled for this dirt. It contains the signatures of dead men and the lies of living ones. I just keep the books," the clerk stammered, his hands shaking. "Then you know the weight of a lie," Thorne replied. "He didn't burn the building. He didn't kill the boy. He took the ledger, tucked it under his duster, and walked out the back door just as Vane's men arrived at the front. By the time they kicked in the door, the office was empty. The evidence of their theft was gone, replaced by a single, heavy iron coin left on the desk, an old marshal's badge, bent and scarred, but still catching the dim light. The power of the Gilded Rail was no longer a secret kept in a vault. It was now in the hands of a man who knew exactly how to use it. Back at the boarding house, Silas Vane looked at the empty space where his power once sat. He realized then that he wasn't hunting a fugitive. He was being hunted by a reckoning. The system he served was built on paper, and Thorn had just taken the match to it. The night didn't end, it simply bled into a gray, suffocating fog that clung to the floor of the valley. By 4 in the morning, the Gilded Rail headquarters was a fortress of desperation. Silas Vane had gathered his remaining 12 men, barricading the doors and taking positions at the upper windows. They were armed with repeating rifles and the frantic energy of men who knew the tide had turned. Vane paced the floorboards, his spurs clicking a jagged rhythm. He wasn't thinking about land rights anymore. He was thinking about the way Thorn had looked in the old stories, a man who didn't miss, and a man who didn't stop. "He's one man," Vane growled, though it was more for himself than his crew. One man with a stolen ledger and a dead badge. When he crosses that street, you don't wait for an order. You turn that road into a lead mine. As the first sliver of sun cut through the mountain notch, the fog began to lift, revealing the empty thoroughfare of Blackwood Creek. The townspeople were gone, tucked behind shuttered windows, holding their breath. Then, the sound arrived. It wasn't the thunder of a charge. It was the slow, rhythmic clop-clop-clop of a single horse walking at a leisurely pace. Thorn emerged from the haze at the far end of the street. He wasn't hiding. He rode down the center of the lane, the charcoal horse moving with a steady, funereal grace. Thorn held the reins in his left hand, his right hung loose at his side, brushing the skirt of his silt-stained duster. "Open up!" Vane screamed from the balcony. The regulators unleashed a volley of fire. The air turned to a storm of splinters and gunsmoke. Glass shattered. Dirt kicked up in geysers around the horse's hooves. But Thorn didn't flinch. He didn't speed up. He moved through the leaden rain as if he were made of the same mountain that had failed to claim him 7 years ago. When he reached the hitching post in front of the headquarters, he dismounted. The firing sputtered and stopped as the gunmen realized their target was still standing. A terrifying silence rushed back into the street. Thorn reached into his coat and pulled out the ledger. He placed it on the mounting block, then looked up at the balcony. "Silas," Thorn called out. The name didn't carry anger, it carried the weight of a sentence. "The ledger is back where it belongs. But the men who wrote it, they have to be settled." Vane stepped into the light, his face twisted. "You're a ghost, Thorn. You're a ghost playing at being a man." "Then let's see if a ghost can bleed," Thorn replied. Vane reached for his sidearm, a fast, desperate draw. Thorn's movement was almost invisible. He didn't draw his weapon so much as it appeared in his hand, a part of his very anatomy. 2 shots rang out, so close together they sounded like a single heartbeat. The first bullet struck the rifle in the hands of the man to Vane's left, shattering the wood and bone. The second found its home in the center of Silas Vane's chest. Vane didn't fly backward. He simply crumpled, his knees hitting the wood of the balcony before he tumbled over the rail, landing in the dirt at Thorn's feet. He looked up at the sky, his eyes wide, as the life leaked out of him and into the thirsty soil of the valley he had tried to own. The remaining regulators stared down from the windows. They looked at the ledger, they looked at their fallen leader, and then they looked at Thorn, who was already reholstering his weapon with a slow, deliberate finality. One by one, the rifles were pushed out of the windows and clattered onto the boardwalk. The siege of Blackwood Creek was over. The system had been broken, not by an army, but by the return of the only thing the company couldn't buy, an honest man. The sun climbed higher, indifferent to the bodies in the street and the sudden, hollow silence of Blackwood Creek. The surviving regulators descended from the building with their hands raised, their eyes avoiding the man on the charcoal horse. They didn't look like conquerors anymore, they looked like small, frightened men who had realized that the world was much older and harsher than their greed. Thorn didn't move as they passed. He stood by the mounting block, his hand resting on the leather cover of the ledger. One by one, the townspeople began to emerge. The widow Miller was the first, her son Toby leaning on her shoulder, his face bandaged but his eyes clear. They didn't cheer. In this part of the country, people knew that justice wasn't a celebration, it was a somber, expensive necessity. Eris, the old clerk, walked across the street and stopped beside Thorn. He looked at the ledger, then at the man who had brought it back. "They'll send more," Eris said, his voice barely a whisper. "The Gilded Rail has offices in Chicago, in New York. They have lawyers and governors. They'll send more men like Vane." Thorn turned his head slowly, the brim of his hat casting a deep shadow over his face. "Let them send the lawyers. The deeds in this book have been witnessed by the people now. A lie only works when it's kept in the dark. Once the sun hits it, it's just paper." He picked up the ledger and handed it to the widow Miller. "This belongs to the valley. Keep it in the church, or the school. Keep it where everyone can see it." Thorn didn't wait for a reply. He caught the reins of his horse and swung into the saddle with a groan of leather that sounded like a long-awaited exhale. He didn't look like a hero out of a dime novel. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had carried the weight of a mountain for 7 years and was finally ready to lay it down. As he rode toward the western edge of town, the people watched him go. He didn't head for the trail or the rail line. He headed for the high country, toward the jagged peaks where the silt and the shadows lived. By the time the sun began its descent, the charcoal horse and its rider were nothing more than a speck against the vast, golden expanse of the frontier. The Gilded Rail eventually collapsed under the weight of its own scandals, the ledger providing the evidence that stripped the company of its holdings. The valley grew green again, the water flowed where it was meant to flow, and the name Elias Thorn passed from news to rumor, and from rumor to myth. They say that on certain mornings, when the fog rolls off the creek and the light is just right, you can still see a rider on the ridge. He doesn't move, and he doesn't speak. He just watches, making sure the balance of the land remains true. The man they thought was dead had ridden at dawn, and in his wake, he left a truth that the West would never forget, that the law is a fragile thing, but justice is as permanent as the stone.